Well, good morning in America and good afternoon in Europe. I'm Josh Lipsky, Director of Programs and Policy at the Atlantic Council's Global Business and Economics Program. And we are so delighted this morning to co-host this event in partnership with Politico and welcome Sir Suma Chakrabarti, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Sir Suma is completing his second and final term as EBRD President after a remarkably successful tenure, and we're very honored he's with us today. As many of you know, he served at the highest levels of international development as well as the British civil service. And he has brought that experience to bear at the EBRD. In fact, right now, the EBRD is responding extraordinarily swiftly to the economic devastation caused by this pandemic. It's committed all its activity in 2020 and 2021 to combat COVID-19's economic impact. And in fact, and Ryan and Sir Suma can bring this up in the discussion, I think that makes it the first and only financial institution, international financial institution, to be solely COVID focused. And we know that emerging and developing economies are going to be especially hard hit in this crisis. We've talked about that here at the Atlantic Council. Many of you were with us when the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, was here last month. And so we're so pleased to have this conversation now with Sir Suma. And the EBRD's 21 billion euro economic rescue package is so critical at this moment, and it's going to help heal the fractures in growth and investment between the advanced and the developing economies. Now, at the Atlantic Council, we're committed to focusing on this issue, not just looking at the current crisis, but looking ahead, looking at what's coming in the global economy. And we're also looking at trying to be creative as we think through these issues. And I think the EBRD has really been at the forefront of that and a model for other institutions. So we're so pleased to have Sir Suma with us. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ryan Heath, Senior Editor at Politico. And by the way, the author of a great newsletter, Global Translations, we're all reading at the Atlantic Council. So if you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Ryan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's a real pleasure to be here. Great to see you, Suma. We normally catch up on the mountain in Davos or somewhere like that, but it's good to catch up with you in a slightly different setting. Maybe to set the scene for those who don't know EBRD so well, you don't rescue governments the way the IMF does. You're financing private projects. But you're not exactly in a parallel universe to governments either. You're always connected into the political scene and the strategic direction of the countries that you're operating in. So to join that thought up with the $21 billion package you have around coronavirus, where are you looking to have impact with that? And how quickly can you get that money out the door?
Well, fundamentally, we're trying to have impact with private sector clients in particular. But also, as you mentioned, Ryan, I think we're also trying to help some of our state clients, state enterprises, municipalities as well. And I think it has 3 or 4, 5 channels maybe. One is essentially what we call a resilience framework. This is trying to provide liquidity for clients, existing clients, either directly or through the banking system, so they get through this crisis period and into the recovery phase. We're also looking at payment deferrals, restructurings for clients too. That's very, very important too. I think the third area would be trade finance. One of the biggest disruptions has been to the trading chains, if you like, the global value chains. And so trying to get as much trade finance into these economies has been very important, using the local banking system, of course. And in fact, in I think March and April, we had our 2 biggest months ever for trade finance going forward as well. We're creating some new frameworks as well for financial institutions and corporates. And I think the other channel to mention is what we call Vital Infrastructure Support Program. This is what one of my colleagues, I think, rather memorably called it at the board meeting, keeping the lights on. Mm-hmm. So obviously, as many infrastructure services become stressed, short of money, government budgets are under great pressure, we need to make sure that they have enough liquidity to get through it. Municipal services would be a classic example of this. All those services that people depend on at municipal level to make sure those services get through the crisis and into the recovery phase. So that 21 billion covers all of these areas and is everything, all our firepower for this year and next year. I actually hope, because we have enough capital capacity, that we can do even more than that. We won't have a shortage of resource problem. We just got to find enough good projects to do that.
Mhm. And is the 21 billion the total sum, or is that co-financed and leveraged with other parties?
That's the total of EBRD's own resources. So on top of that, we'd be mobilizing funding, you're quite right, from other players too, sometimes co-financing. So the total value of what we do will be much higher than that, depending on how much we can co-finance, syndicate with others as well.
Now, for most of our careers, 21 billion would have sounded like a huge figure or an unimaginable sum for most people in most organizations. And we're now in a world where globally trillions are being spent to try and deal with the effects of coronavirus. And when I went to add it all up, it seems like there's around about $1,000 in domestic spending for every $1 in global coordination and response. And I guess your bank falls somewhere in between, not domestic and not global at the same time. But I think that the point I'm trying to make is that it really feels like the whole is less than the sum of the parts at the moment when you look at the way all of that government money and other money is being mobilized. What should we do to rebalance that situation in your view?
So I think your analysis, in my view, is spot on. I think if you go back 5 years to the Addis conference, when we knew the 2030 agenda was coming, we'd had the financing for development agreement on that. We all knew what we had to do. We actually had to get more private sector finance into the system. I think, frankly, in the 5 years, only stuttering progress has been made on that anyway. Then along comes COVID-19, and actually, whatever numbers we had before, we need to redo them because the arithmetic has changed completely. And the amount of financing that's now required from public and private sources is a quantum much greater. So I personally think we need to go back to the drawing board internationally and take a new look, a fresh look at the quantity and quality of financing that we need for the next 10 years through 2030 and beyond, given the agenda we've now got and the recovery we now need to help these countries make as well. So I would call for a new Addis, if you like, to actually go back and think about the amounts. And actually that, of course, requires strong leadership from particularly the richer nations to come up with the plans, working with multilateral institutions like myself as well, because I think we have got to do much more. And that's why I say 21 billion for me is a sort of down payment. It's not the end of the story. It's got to be much more than that. And a lot of this money is going to have to come from private financiers as well, not just the state, because state budgets are under pressure. I think people will be worrying about budget deficits, although I think maybe the days of monetarist approach towards public spending, I think that's moving away from that actually. But I think what we've got to do is tap into sovereign wealth funds much better than we've been doing, pension funds and others, to really get the leverage, get the multiplier effect that we need into the system. And that's why I think we have to revisit the Addis agreement very soon, I think, in order to make headway quickly.
Yeah. And do you think that's something that can happen in isolation from some broader reassessment of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? I don't hear too much chatter about it, but I do hear it out there now, where some people just say.
So I think the goals are still highly relevant and the correct goals. I think they're the best description, I've always said, of all the development characteristics. The old Millennium Development Goals were good, but they described a subset of the total challenge. I think the SDGs, yes, there's lots of them, but they do describe the totality and the complexity of that challenge. So I don't think we need to revisit the goals. I hope we don't need to revisit the timeline either. But what we do need to revisit is the financing and the speed at which we do that. And that can only happen not just with the multilateral development banks and our leaderships, but I think with the major shareholders of these institutions and major governments, but also, again, the private sector out there, private sector finances need to be involved as well.
I think undoubtedly you are right on the speed there. But I'm going to take on the role of a watchdog for a second. And a watchdog would say that with lenders under pressure to pump out cash, authorities are going to be under a heightened risk of fraud, money laundering. How is your bank defending itself? And have you come across anyone trying to abuse the system so far?
So not so far, no. In fact, we have like all the multilaterals, we have extremely strong internal controls on compliance, integrity, and all those sorts of things. So that hasn't been the issue really. All our existing controls are still in play, and so I'm not seeing that as a problem much more. What I think is a bigger issue actually isn't the sort of fraud integrity issues. It's much more the disbursement issue.
Mhm.
So it's all very well for multilateral banks like mine to approve these sums and then sign the documents, have nice ceremonies. But actually, what really matters, what really transforms the economy, is the money reaching the client, whether it's in the private sector or the state sector. And that means hard work, I think, to get disbursements up much more. It's particularly in the private sector, we tend to do very well in terms of disbursement ratios. But if you look across the multilateral scene, you'll see disbursement ratios for sovereign clients are much more sticky. They're much slower because they quite often involve a lot more policy reform, policy conditionality. They involve legislatures as well. And that tends to slow down the whole process. We have got to crack that problem because, frankly, we can't sit around waiting for disbursements to take their time. We've got to get the money into these economies fast. So that is, for me, I think, the bigger problem at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And to make sure I understand that right, is that a case where governments or systems of governance where you're working, because you don't always work in countries that have the same standards of rule of law and transparency?
That's right.
You find yourself caught up sometimes by the messiness of that.
Yeah, so one of the big things I think in the last years that I've been president, we've really pushed on is this concept of trying to improve, first of all, the investment climate, but also the economic governance, so that these things do become better. So our private sector clients tell us a lot about how governments work with them, what needs improving. So we are impacted on things like procurement systems. These are quite technical things, but how can you get a procurement system to be faster, but also more objective and transparent? And so there's no graft involved at all. That's one of the biggest issues we work on as well. How can you create policy environments which then attract more private sector financing into a country? And I'm very fond of, and so I'll use this example again, the famous Benban solar park in Egypt, in Upper Egypt. It's going to end up, as I think already is, the largest solar park in Africa for sure. Bit of a debate whether it's the largest one in the world. But the great thing about that was we worked with the Egyptian government to get the regulatory environment right, and such that not just EBRD, although we're the lead financier, but all the other multilateral banks, private sector piled in because the regulatory environment, the investment climate, if you like, had improved so much. That work has to continue. You can't just get parked because of the COVID crisis. In fact, it probably makes it more urgent because we need the flows of finance to be faster even. So that has to continue for the future.
Mm-hmm. It's a good project to bring up because I wanted to pivot to some questions on the theme of leadership. And I wanted to start by asking whether you had any premonition when you started this job that you'd be running a green pandemic bank by the end of it. It feels like at one level a very shift, but also not what the history of your bank is at all.
So I think, when you start these jobs 8 years ago, and there are a number of things I wouldn't have predicted. I wouldn't have predicted what happened on Russia at that time, which was our biggest recipient country at the time. And I wouldn't have predicted, as you say, this pandemic at the time. What's important is whether a bank can respond rapidly in a resilient fashion to these challenges. And I think in both cases we've done that and we continue to do so. But it's also important not to lose sight during these response to crises, if you like, of the eternal issues that you've got to resolve in order to offer a brighter future. And you mentioned green. That's, for us at EBRD, we have made our reputation as being the green multilateral. Every multilateral, of course, is doing work in this area, but this has been the biggest part of EBRD's transformation since, I think, 2005-06, actually, when we first started. But we've taken it to new heights. Last year, 46% of our investments were in the green economy space. We're about to approve, hopefully within the next month, our new generation of green economy transition financing and strategy, and that will, I think, have even higher targets going forward. It's important in a crisis to make sure these sort of issues like green are captured in the projects you do. So it's not as if, because we're in a crisis, we should just park the green agenda. We have this approach called tilt to green. So within the solidarity package that is for this year and next year, we're trying to make sure even more of our projects actually are trying to do the right thing in terms of financing renewables, energy efficiency, all these sort of things that we're well known for, green cities and so on. So that's really important. And green wouldn't be the only area I'd mention. I'd also mention equality of opportunity, things like that, as well as being very important in how we tackle the crisis.
100%. Now, let's talk about this trend towards economic nationalism for a minute or two. The way I see it, European leaders are looking inward. Yes, they've got a green agenda. It's not always backwards, but it is inwards, let's say. President Trump looks inwards. China seems so often to be decoupling from the West or looking to be an engine of itself with domestic consumption. Given all of that, do you feel let down or disconnected by politicians and the governments that you work with sometimes?
So, I mean, this is the 40-year career. It's been through various ups and downs in terms of how I feel about leadership. I think you're right, though, Ryan. Right now, we're going through a sort of inward-looking period. I think it was there actually even before the crisis. I think the crisis maybe has exacerbated some of the tendencies. I think the trade disputes and discussions between US and China have taken up a lot of bandwidth for those two countries. And I think within the EU, this whole concept of strategic autonomy, that seems to be the new buzz phrase there. I do worry that that's making, again, European leaders who had actually, until recently, been very much reaching out to the wider world. I think, again, I worry that makes, some of what I said more difficult to achieve. I hope I'm not whistling in the wind when I say we need a new financing for development approach. But it will require new leaders, I think, to come to the fore. I think President Macron has made some good comments about the need for a multilateral push. I think people like Jacinda Ardern clearly has been very successful in tackling the COVID crisis. So I think there are leaders who could make this push, and we need them to come much more to the fore going forward. And within countries, I think it's up to EBRD and others to challenge the protectionist mantra, to challenge the sort of return to old ideas which didn't work out before, and also to challenge ideas which are sort of beggar thy neighbor ideas. And so that is something I think we must do as an institution. It goes to the heart of our mandate, after all.
Mm-hmm. Have we got any new arguments on that front, where I see a little bit of a replay of the 2008 financial crisis? And whereas maybe I'm projecting, at the time I was a bit younger, I hadn't been through a huge global crisis like that before, and it felt invigorating to have this battle between those who wanted to be globalist and outward looking and those who wanted to be inward looking. And this time round, I feel like sometimes it's the same old faces using the same old arguments, with maybe a bit of green thrown in to make it new and interesting. But are there new arguments we can say to people who feel let down by globalization or left out of the process?
Yeah, I think my worry is actually that some of those people who may feel let down by globalization, locked out of a good economic future, actually their fortunes going forward are much more negatively affected by the COVID crisis than others. I'll give you an example. The adage of last in, first out in terms of labor market. So the gains that have been made in recent years on, women in the labor force, women's access to finance, young people, because we were all worried about youth unemployment. The enormous efforts have been made in many countries, and also underdeveloped regions, if you like, the inclusion agenda writ large. There is a risk, I think, that in a crisis like the COVID one, which has economic recession as well looming, that many of these groups will actually, again, be put at the back of the queue.
Mhm.
It is absolutely important, I think, that not just EBRD, but leaders within countries speak up for them. I think actually this is going to happen anyway, because many of them are young people who will no longer accept actually that their futures are going to be negatively impacted for a generation. And as I certainly notice in many of the countries in Central Asia, North Africa and others, Western Balkans, people speaking up much more as part of a democratization process that is going on. Yes, it's choppy in many of those countries, that process, but it is going on. And I think leaders can't ignore it. It just builds up more social and political problems for them if they do ignore that. So I think there is some hope here. And that's why I place a lot of emphasis on equality of opportunity, as
Mhm.
along with green, as being a really big theme. And the other area I would highlight is, that some things are happening at a more accelerated rate. We don't know quite how it's going to work out. So here we are having this conversation. You're in New York. I'm in Oxford. The future of work has arrived. Arrived earlier than we thought it was going to arrive. And so technology and digital technology in particular becomes a really big theme. Now, what does that mean? Because in the past, people worried about, and they have, since the Industrial Revolution, worried about how technology was going to actually make people poorer, particularly, or the returns would only go to certain people. That has not proved to be the case. But there's again that concern. So how do we make sure technology actually enables better economic futures for people of the world, people in developing countries, emerging markets? I think that's going to be fundamental as well. I highlight those three areas: green, equality of opportunity, technology. They're actually going to be the three main themes of EBRD's next 5-year strategy, which will be approved in the autumn. And I think it's not a surprise in a way, because they are responding to what was there before the crisis, but the crisis, I think, has made those three themes even starker and more important going forward.
I think you're right. If we talk about something like multilateralism or social progress, it's not a single thing you can stab to death or get rid of. Some of it might be unwound and some people might face difficulty, but there's this kind of very thick knot of roots that keeps something like that in place, at least for a bit longer, I would hope. Thinking a bit about the role of development banks in that multilateral system, what role can you play to keep the system afloat? And is this now a chance where EBRD can work with other regional and global institutions to kind of be more efficient than whatever was going on previously?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. There have been so many studies over the last few years about how, in a nutshell, how the system becomes more than the sum of its parts, really. And the G20 did this Eminent Persons Group piece of work on this. There's been the Wise Persons Group in Europe as well. And it requires a big shift, and not just by the leadership and managements of these institutions like EBRD, but of our shareholders. They have to start thinking of the system as a system, not as individual entities. They have to start recognizing that each of the institutions have different skill sets, different expertise. The reason why I can talk about private sector in these countries isn't just because EBRD focuses on the private sector, but because we have 50 officers on the ground, not just in capital cities, but also in the provincial cities, collecting information at market intelligence, what's happening at the SME level, what's happening at various levels. So we have a specific set of expertise, which is really useful in the international system. But that isn't to me to say that World Bank, African Development Bank, others, that we partner, they have their own specific roles as well, which we shouldn't try and duplicate. We should actually try and mesh together. That meshing together hasn't yet happened. And it's not just a technical thing. It's actually a leadership issue, I think, whereby the shareholders need to think together collectively about the different skill sets and expertise and financing modalities of these different institutions. Again, I think financing for development, ADIS 2, if you like, would be a very useful way to try and do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage that. But this time round, I would also not just produce a report and hope that someone's going to take notice of it and it's not going to gather dust on a shelf. it really requires that report to have an implementation capacity as well built into it. And that's what we've probably lacked through all the various studies and working groups that we've had over the years. It's been the follow-up.
Mm-hmm. Now, I realized I've been neglecting the audience questions. There's one that is a slight overlap with what I just asked, but Vinet Sharma wanted to know how you partner with organizations like the World Bank to deploy funds in certain COVID projects, for example.
So, great question. So this goes to the heart of the system-wide approach. And I think there are three tiers, really, that we're talking about here of cooperation with the World Bank and other multilateral development banks, and the IMF, I should say, as well. So the heads of these institutions, we meet, and we meet usually 2 or 3 times a year. But because of this crisis, we have been meeting very frequently, particularly early on in the crisis. Every couple of weeks, we've been having calls to try and discuss common issues and then set out actions that should be taken on board. And that's gone well, I think. The second level also is actually at a technical level, if you like, whereby what the heads say has to be then translated into actual work programs that fit together. But I think the biggest prize is the country level, because each country is very different, and it's very important that the country teams actually design in response to country governments, to the private sectors in those countries, what each institution should be doing. So what I'm most proud of, despite the lockdowns in all these countries, is the work that's going on between our multilateral bank teams in country. And that's been extremely important, I think, in terms of going forward. It's led to some co-financing opportunities for us with the Asian Development Bank, with IFC, with the European Investment Bank. So that is, I think, the heart of this going forward, I think. So it's going well, but I think we need to maintain this, I would say, post-COVID as well. I think it's had a bit of a push, actually, because of the COVID crisis, this coordination, but it needs to be maintained afterwards too.
I think Kristalina Georgieva will be a big fan of it going forward as well. Do you ever find yourself in competition with other banks? Not deliberately so, but I'm thinking somebody or some organization like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's a new player. It made some fairly aggressive moves to get European partners on board. Do you ever line up realizing you're both trying to fund the same project or need to elbow each other out of the way?
So the AIIB, actually, because we were the previous new kid on the block, we actually helped with a lot of the setup, if you like, of the AIIB. So, but yes, from time to time, you will get, for sure, issues of multilateral banks chasing the same project in the same country or the same sectors. And usually the issues turn around 2 things. One is around pricing, and the other is around policy conditionality or links to policy reform. We at EBRD, we very much believe in market pricing. Of course, with every project, you also have some grant support, which may overall soften the terms, but market pricing is the heart of what we do, because we want to create markets, and IFC is our great partner in that, both of us championing that approach. But we also go one step further. We strongly believe in having a link to policy. Good policies really matter for not just us, but for attracting more private sector investment. So it's really important also to coordinate better on policy issues too. I think quite interestingly for EBRD in my 8 years, probably our strongest partner on many of the policy issues has been the IMF. Starting with, let's say, Ukraine, where the IMF would ask us to help them write some of the program conditionality because of our knowledge of the private sector, the corruption issues, and so on. That has, led to more working together in many countries. We actually now have systematic reviews together of our joint work in many countries. But that is also, we do a lot of joint work with Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, IFC, EIB, and now also with AIIB. They've co-financed a number of projects with us as well. Broadly speaking, we resolve the issues when there are disputes. I think it's quite often top management get together and try to work out, without creating a sort of blame game about it, as to what's gone wrong here in terms of our joint objective, which is sustainable market economies that are developing well.
Maybe time to pivot to a little bit of a world tour. We've got lots of different regions that you're operating in and lots of things to get through. So maybe a question about America. I think, to go from a situation where different banks might be competing to fund a project, one of the big themes of this pandemic, I think, is really a kind of American withdrawal of leadership. Like the US doesn't seem as invested in the global and international forums that it used to be invested in. How does that affect an organization like yours? What do you perceive to be the need for American leadership in these international forums?
So I think it's really important for the United States, which is quite often the largest shareholder in most of these institutions, including in EBRD, to have a positive agenda. And I think what I would encourage is for the United States to try and develop a set of issues which it cares about, of course, which Congress cares about, of course, but which also can make some common cause with others as well, and can actually motivate others as well. I think it's difficult for me in my generation to envisage a multilateral system, development bank system, without the United States leadership. Certainly, if I think of nearly all the big initiatives that I've seen in my career, the United States has been at the center, not always a leader, but without the United States support, wouldn't have gone through. And in many cases, the United States has been a leader. So in the case of EBRD, I think our expansion to the Middle East, what we call Southern Eastern Mediterranean, very much it was the EU, United States, UK, and France together who really pushed that. And I think the United States leadership really mattered in that. I think of some of the policy work we do in some of the countries where policy reform is fundamental. Ukraine, United States, and EBRD work very closely together in the past on Ukraine as well. So I can give country examples, I can give thematic examples. The gender initiative of EBRD, again, the United States was a big champion of that. I would love to see the United States really back in that sort of mood of wanting to have a really positive agenda for the multilateral system and the development banks within that.
Thinking of examples like Ukraine and the gender projects, is it that the US is just now absent or silent, or is it somehow having a negative effect? It's undermining what you're doing and other organizations are doing.
I don't think it's undermining. I think it's much more that it's not speaking up as much as it used to on some of these issues. I think I can say that. I think there are many people in the United States system who I admire, and across the parties actually, and who have been very important to the development of these countries. I just think that voice is a little stilled at the moment, and I would like to see much more of it going forward.
And now turning to China, the other big player on the global scene these days in lots of respects. A lot of people sort of at one level say China needs to be more responsible, more involved. Then when China does get involved and does get loud, a lot of those same people don't like it. They think they overstep their mark. What do you think is the role China needs to play as a financial actor on the global scene? And let's take the example of the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think countries are taking on too much risk in taking on debt related to that sort of project?
So I think clearly what we want is China to become a major, development power in the sense of not just financing, but quality and standards. So I think the big issue around Belt and Road, and there's been a lot of debate on that, is first thing I should say, I think it's really important to recognize this isn't just about China doing things to countries. I mean, many of these countries, they have their own views on things. They're not sort of bystanders in some sort of great game. So it's their views really matter. Now, what I have always said is I think what's important is to improve the quality of all development finance, including Chinese development finance. So I am very much in favor of moving away from tying of any development assistance to national agendas, whether they be commercial agendas or political agendas. I think very much in favor of taking account of full debt sustainability issues before lending to countries. I think that's really important. And then I'm absolutely in favor of ensuring the right environmental, social, governance standards, procurement standards flow through all the financing that goes forward. You have to either take a view that the huge amount of Chinese financing is a challenge or it's an opportunity. I think, I'd like to push on the opportunity side. The other thing I would say is it's dangerous for any country to think of another country as just homogenous. I think it would be very odd if the Chinese thought all Americans thought the same. I think it's really odd if, Americans or Europeans think all Chinese think the same. There's a very heterogeneous spectrum of thinking in China. Quite often the shareholders in China, Ministry of Finance, the People's Bank of China, they're actually at the forefront of being very innovative, actually have very similar viewpoints as to what should happen with development financing coming from China or any other place. We should make common cause with people like that. And I think a lot more needs to be done on that front too. So there is a positive agenda, I think, that is worth pursuing with China, India, new development players, if you like, coming through into the system.
It's maybe a good moment to spin the globe further all the way over to Africa. China's investments there have been fairly controversial, and it's a region that your bank has started to invest in over the last decade. And in fact, you started your career in Africa. So tell us a bit about what can be done to keep Africa as part of the COVID global agenda. And, has your investment been working out? What's the state of play there?
So we've been extremely successful in North Africa, as we're in 3 countries at the moment in North Africa, which is Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. I fully expect within the next 18 months we'll be investing in Algeria. It's very much, and that's an interesting one because Algeria's had a very state-dominated economic system and political system, and there's an opportunity now to move forward, I think, for diversification and the private sector. So it's been very successful. It's been the fastest growing portfolio. I think Egypt has been our largest market for 2 years running now. And so I'm excited by the prospects there as well. It's also the region, interestingly, which has been championing a further limited incremental expansion of EBRD into sub-Saharan Africa. They're their direct neighbors. Many companies, let's say Moroccan companies, for example, want to invest in sub-Saharan Africa. They know EBRD well because they've invested with us in Morocco. They'd like to take that same magic further south. And so there's both a political and a commercial and a development push for EBRD to consider at least the expansion further south. And I think COVID has amplified that for me, because what's happening is quite striking. I mean, we're going to have, according to the World Bank, the first continent-wide recession for 25 years in sub-Saharan Africa. I think 1/3 of African workforce are going to either lose their jobs or certainly their incomes are going to be very badly affected. So this is a bit of a crisis, it seems to me, and it's an urgent need, really. And then on top of that, we've got the 2030 agenda in Africa. I don't think we can achieve the 2030 agenda without Africa making sharp progress going forward. And the private sector, the creation of jobs is really important to that. So I see a strong role for EBRD going forward, and I hope our shareholders will, in due course, agree with that proposition. But it again goes back to recognizing that what has happened with COVID is, I think, we are, as sort of the rest of the world, not as focused on Africa as we were 3 or 4 months ago. And we have to get refocused on it. I think the EU strategy for Africa was an excellent document, but it didn't get as much airtime because of when it came out, and didn't get as much playtime, if you like. So I think it's really important the EU, of course, US, North America, and Japan and others, the bigger shareholders of an institution like mine, recognize the imperative politically, economically, commercially for all of us to do a lot more in sub-Saharan Africa going forward.
Now, I don't mean that these next 2 questions are directly about sub-Saharan Africa, but I got 2 audience questions in that I wanted to introduce. And since we're on emerging markets, it's worth asking now. The first one is from an anonymous attendee, so I'm sorry I can't explain who it is, but they ask which emerging markets you think are best situated to withstand economic downturn that we're experiencing right now. Where would you put your bet if you were a betting man?
So this is interesting. If you look at our forecasts, maybe that's one way to do it, because we have such a heterogeneous region, as I said earlier. The overall forecast is that there's about a 6.5% swing downwards. We were expecting before COVID something like a 3% growth rate this year across our countries of operation, but we're now expecting that to be minus 3.5%. But the contractions are unevenly spread. So Central Asia, North Africa, not as badly hit as some of the European Union economies and Western Balkans, places like that. But then if you look at the recovery phase, let's say our forecast for 2021, where we expect, nearly 5%, 4.8% growth across our region, again, the recovery is unevenly spread. I think the Western Balkans, provided tourism comes back, of course, and remittances come back, we're expecting a very sharp rebound indeed. Maybe not as sharp a rebound in some of the other regions. I would say longer term, what we call the European neighborhood and Central Asia, plus Central Asia, is really worth taking a bet on. I mean, these are economies where the skill sets and education levels are pretty good, but need a lot more investment. So in the Western Balkans, the thing I've been pushing with EBRD is very much to try and help them with their process of moving towards EU membership, using that as a way to galvanize reform, but also invest more, particularly in cross-border projects as well. Yeah. I think in Central Asia, we have got a real change going on. I mean, Kazakhstan was always the largest economy, and somewhere we must keep investing. But what is happening in Uzbekistan is quite striking. I mean, it was, of course, the Economist's Country of the Year last year, for a good reason. The new president, not so new now, 3 years in, has really transformed the landscape in terms of reform, both economic and political reform. Our numbers, we've just returned 3 years ago to investing in there, are already over €1 billion of investment. That's another emerging market I would look at as well. So I think Central Asia definitely is worth looking at. Of course, the two largest markets, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Yeah. And then, as I said, the Middle East, I think there's plenty of opportunity there, particularly in Egypt, Morocco, and now Tunisia as well. Tunisia, where the Arab Spring, I think, has been, in a way, most fulfilled in terms of political reform as well as economic opportunity.
Mm-hmm. You got another tough question coming in from LinkedIn off the back of some of that. The EBRD, you were set up to support transition to multi-party democratic political systems, but not all of those countries you mentioned are that. And if we look at different NGO reports, it feels like democracy is going backwards, in fact, in some countries. So what is the balance you are trying to strike there? Like at what point do you say enough is enough, we can't invest in this country? Or is it about investing in the people rather than the government?
So first of all, thank you for that question, because EBRD is an unusual multilateral development bank. We were set up really to invest in countries that are making progress towards multi-party democracy and pluralism, if you like. And it's clearly been an uneven ride. I mean, no one's going to pretend otherwise. The first thing is that, I insisted that we actually have a grown-up, honest debate about this. So we no longer go around saying every country is doing fine. That is just not true anymore. We actually are very honest and open with our political assessments and about every country, and you can see that. But it's also, I think, very important for civil society and development practitioners like me is to acknowledge that if you take a long-term view in several of the countries, and I just mentioned two of them, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, or Tunisia, another one, I think actually the changes in recent years have been in the positive direction. It is unfortunately one of the problems of the profession we're part of that we tend to not talk about those positive changes as much as we do about negative changes. It's also important to recognize that the changes, negative and positive, not just in non-EU, they're across all these countries that we operate in. How does EBRD respond to this? It's a set of fluctuating picture, well, very much the way I've been trying to do this while I've been president is to say more for more. The more reform you do, the more we will do with you. And if you really don't do much reform, if you're going down a path which is less, well, we'll be doing less. And we're very open and blunt about that. And that has got shareholder support, that approach, I think. And that's why I think in the Uzbekistan case, we've had this huge spike in our lending after years of doing nothing, really. Once there was a political change and a desire for reform as well. That opened up the economic and political space. And that's, I think, how it should be as well. But it's also important to tell it as we see it. And that, I think, was what we now do in our political assessments, much more than in previous era.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can finish our global tour by coming home, as it were, to Europe and the European Union. You are a London-based bank. You're not an EU institution, which I guess is a confusion some people make some of the time. But nevertheless, you've been in this environment of the EU and the UK separating, or at least putting a little bit of distance between themselves. How has the experience been of skating over that Brexit ice? And what's your relationship now to the EU as it develops recovery plans and things like that?
Sure. So look, I mean, I don't think I would ever claim that this has been an easy ride for the EBRD. We're not a EU bank, but I have always used the phrase, we're a global institution with a European heart. The EU has a majority shareholding. It retains that majority even after the UK exit from the EU. So the EU matters. And the EU is actually the biggest donor supporter of EBRD. And much of our work in many of the countries where we operate, we and the Commission are working really, really closely in the neighborhood particularly. So that there's a bedrock there. And it may be, it's one of those interesting artifacts of my 8 years that it took a British president to create an office in Brussels. Weirdly, that we didn't have one. When I arrived, I could understand why, given how much work we had to do with the Commission. So we've got that office. It's a great office. It has helped us actually in the relationship with the European Union immensely, with the past Commission and with the new Commission as well. So that's important. So that relationship is absolutely bedrock. And during this process of dealing with COVID, it's been really important, my level below, to engage with the Commission, commissioners. Commissioner Vaheli and I do stuff to, a lot of these sort of events together to show a Team Europe approach. And we're very proud of being part of the Team Europe approach for the neighborhood. And I think that's really important. So it's a bedrock part of what EBRD is about going forward. And in terms of the UK and the EU, I think EBRD is a perfect bridge, frankly. It has roots in the UK, of course, through its headquarters. It's where most of our staff live and work. And of course, there's a fantastic development diaspora in the UK, which we can use always. And of course, then there's the link between us and the EU that I just described. So I think we're a perfect bridge for the future between the UK and the EU.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was a recovery funding package announced today. I'm not fully caught up on all of the details yet, but it seems to me that it's a little, in some ways, it's a sign of success of what you've been doing at the bank over the course of the last 30 years, where some of the Central and Eastern European countries might end up paying in to benefit the richer countries that were really hard hit by COVID and don't have that budgetary space to fund all of it, which is the reverse of the EU's policy over the last 30 years, which was funneling money to those Central and Eastern European countries. Is that a sign of success? Is there a risk of backlash because those countries still have more work and more catching up to do?
I think I haven't got up with the details either yet, Ryan, but if it is as reported, then it is a real breakthrough moment in many ways, because it's a sense of a more equalized approach to member states, I think, whereby the less economically advanced countries of Eastern Europe see that they have a responsibility and duty to also help others through this as well. And that's wonderful if that's happening. I think I've also noticed in the case of the EBRD over the last few years that some of those countries have begun to produce small amounts of grant funding as donors into EBRD, although not as much as I'd like. I'd like them to do a lot more because they're the more advanced countries compared with Turkey, Azerbaijan, and others who've produced a lot more funding. But it's a start, and I think it's a start of saying that, you know, we actually have a responsibility now beyond just our borders towards a wider system. So that's a good sign.
Mm-hmm. Now, a couple more audience questions. One is from John Rieger, and he asks what you would like to see in the Commission's next enlargement package. You know, I think basically he's driving at, would countries like Albania and North Macedonia, should they be let in, or others perhaps?
Well, I think once you set certain criteria and countries meet those criteria, it's important to stick to the rules of the game and move forward. And so I think it's a great decision that Albania and North Macedonia moving forward with that. And we know that Montenegro is, of course, much further ahead in the process as well. I hope the Serbia-Kosovo issues will be resolved, and that, again, those two countries can move forward too. So I'm actually quite optimistic that in my lifetime, at least, these countries will be members of the European Union.
I hope. You're a long time yet, Suma.
You can never be sure. And
scenario we're talking about.
So certainly, I think the role of EBRD is going to be fundamental in doing that, just as it was with Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and the Baltic states. I mean, we did, and Slovenia, we did a massive amount of work. And Croatia was probably the last big example where, before membership, we did so much work, investment policy work with them to help them become members of the European Union back in 2013. And we continue with that. So what I want to do, particularly with those two countries, Albania and North Macedonia, is move to signing what we call, let's just call them agreements, whereby we would specify which areas of the accession process do they need most help in, and where EBRD can truly add value. We can't in every area, but we can in certain areas, and actually have therefore long-term plans for EBRD engagement in those two countries to help them move through on the accession timetable. This, of course, requires very close work with the Commission as well. And there will be, I think, in November, a new Commission plan for the Western Balkan Investment and Policy Plan. We will be very much closely involved in helping to design it, and then financing it and advising on the policy issues as well. Mm-hmm. So that's where we should be, I think, in this debate.
Great. Now we've got a green question from Elliot R. He asks or says, you mentioned the need to leverage more private sector capital. Can you talk about how EBRD is doing that, and if possible, cite several green energy projects that have got substantial private investment in the Western Balkans and the Black Sea regions?
So, I mean, I think I mentioned my favorite example, which is, of course, the Benban solar park. I can mention examples, long list of examples, whether it's in the Western Balkans or in other regions. I think, let me tell you what I'm proud of. I think, firstly, I'm proud of the transfer from theory to practice of this idea of you create the right environment, regulatory environment, investment environment that drags in the private sector investors with EBRD and others after that. I think that has really been shown to be working now, not just in Egypt, in Central Asia and other places too. Secondly, I think I'm really proud of the fact that we have a certain number of products which really seem to be very, very, helpful to private and public sector clients. So let me just name a couple of them. One would be, I think, the whole question of energy efficiency in whether it's in municipal level or whether it's in private sector clients, SMEs, and so on, using local banking system quite often to do that. These energy efficiency frameworks have been a great, great success everywhere that they've gone.
And that's like retrofitting buildings, putting...
Absolutely, and public buildings, private buildings, also production processes to make them much more green as well. And I think the other one that which has really been a recent big innovation for us is the Green Cities program. This is where you don't just get money by saying, I want to be a green city. Mayors and their teams have to show how they're going to achieve that by having a proper plan, by actually putting that together, by then having a model project that we would finance to make sure that the plan works, and then it takes off. And this is now in so many of our countries of operations. I've actually lost track of how many green cities we now have, but it's a large number. And this has been a real takeoff. That's why I go back to the Vital Infrastructure Support Program, because I think it's really important to protect those projects and those operations, those services in those economies.
Nicole Golding's got a really relevant question there, where some of the other organizations that need protecting at the moment are small and medium-sized businesses. So she asks how far EBRD support goes in that direction, and is it going to ramp up in the pandemic response?
Yeah. So SMEs absolutely vital. SMEs were vital to EBRD's business model before the crisis, even more so now, because the biggest worry we have is that many SMEs will go out of business during this crisis, not because they're fundamentally insolvent. No, why would we have invested in them if we thought that in the first place? But because they have a liquidity crunch right now, and they need financing to get through into the recovery phase. So that's why I think the resilience framework I mentioned is really important. Trying to do these restructurings, these payment deferrals, very important for SMEs and other clients too. I think the other side of it is actually advisory. So all these offices that we have in the field, particularly those outside the capital cities, they do a lot of advisory work with SMEs. Now, this is a different sort of advice that's required in the next year and a half, really. Normally you'd be advising, let's say, on what is your long-term investment plan? How would you get a bank to finance that? Right now, you're saying, how would you get through this crisis? What sort of corporate governance do you need? What sort of decision-making process do you need in your SME? What should we be focusing on? What's urgent? What's nice to have but can wait? That is a different sort of approach, and those advisory services are so important to the leaders and managers of SMEs across the 38 countries in which EBRD is operating. So I think you'll see us scaling up even more within that 21 billion I mentioned. I think you will see SME share will be quite high compared with even past years.
Now we're getting close to the end of our time, so I thought I might ask you one of those great retrospective hindsight sort of questions. If you had the chance of a do-over or a second go at being president, what's something you'd change? Is there a project area you'd double financing to, or a country you'd just run away from at first sight?
So I think, look, I mean, when you run these development banks, the job of a president, at least the way I thought of it, and I'm sure others will disagree, and so they should if they can think differently about this, of course. I think the job of the president is to really try and move the envelope and change the envelope, and not just operate within the envelope always. But to do that, you have to get strong shareholder support. And I think one of the most difficult things that we have faced in EBRD is to have the voice of the countries of operations as strong as I would have liked it. I think partly our shareholding structure, and which does that, but it has meant quite often that the management and the president have been quite often the voice of people who don't have as much voice within the institution in driving the strategy of the institution. That is something that I think it's a sort of part of the weather that we have. But within that, I think we have made major progress. I think the thing I'm proud of is the focus on the poorest of our countries. If you like, the Western Balkans, the neighborhood, North Africa, the delivery in North Africa from a standing start, in Turkey and in Central Asia, I think I'm very proud of. And also, I'd say in Romania, Bulgaria, two of the poorer EU nations, of course, as well. I think that's something proud of. And I think then it's really the thematics. I think the green agenda, I'm really humbled by what the team has done, the EBRD staff, management have done to take that forward. It was a passion of mine when I arrived. I found I was pushing at an open door, and it's really taken off to such an extent. It's wonderful. And we've made a start on gender. We've made a start on inclusion, but we're in the foothills. And I think that's I hope my successor takes that agenda forward. But they'll have their own thoughts, they'll have their own views, and so they should.
Mm-hmm. Now, final question. Your term's up in a couple of months, but 63 is the new 50. What is next for Suma Chakrabarti?
Well, that means I've got 2 years left then, because another 2 to go. Look, I don't know. I think, having given a lot of my career to 2 things, international development and public service reform, I think it's not the time to suggest that I open the batting for India cricket. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think it's going to have to be something in those areas. I want to stay very closely involved in the development scene. So whether it's advising emerging markets, working with think tanks, doing a bit of writing and lecturing, but I also want to work a lot with some of the younger people who are coming through into development, actually, to try and convince them this is worth having a long-term career in, actually, whether it's in the private sector area or public sector area. So I will be spending, I think, quite a bit of time trying to think about how to do that to help them have the same passion for this subject that I've had over the years.
Sounds like it will be a very fulfilling period. Suma Chakrabarti, thank you so much for joining us at this Atlantic Council Politico event.
Thank you, Ryan.
And thanks to all of you for joining wherever it was in the world that you joined from. We hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you very much.